All right, Briahna, what's on your radar today?
Well, Robbie, Democrats are bribing voters. Democracy is imperiled. At least that's the messaging coming from establishment figures following Biden's student debt cancellation announcement. Former Rising co-host Buck Sexton described the $10,000 of relief for students too poor to pay for college as a taxpayer-funded bribe, perhaps forgetting that student debtors are taxpayers too. Mitt Romney tweeted that it was sad to see what's being done to bribe the voters. And as I discussed in yesterday's Radar, Texas Senator Ted Cruz warned that bong-smoking baristas might actually vote now that the government had, well, improved their lives. For shame. But with all of this talk of bribery, there's shockingly little discussion about the biggest bribe ever in American history, which happened just last week. Yes, just last week, The Lever broke a story about the largest known donation to a political advocacy group in American history. $1.6 billion worth of bribe. Who was it from? Who was it going to? And what did it purchase? Is the billionaire donor likely to demand something that's in your interest as an average working American? Or should you be concerned? Let's get into it. The donor is Barry Seed, a 90-year-old manufacturing magnate who made his fortune as CEO of a Chicago company now known as Trip Light. Seed donated 100% of the shares of Trip Light before the company was bought by an Irish conglomerate for $1.65 billion, according to reporting by the New York Times. And true to type, the billionaire transaction was structured in a way that completely avoided any and all tax liability. Now, before we get into the who, where, what, when, and why, let's put the size of that donation into context. $1.6 billion is more than the total $1.5 billion spent in 2020, an election year, by 15 of the most politically active, democratically aligned nonprofit organizations. The top 15 Republican-aligned groups spent only $900 million during that same period. But Democrat or Republican, that's a lot of money coming from one source. It's a lot of money behind just one man's agenda. Democrat or conservative, everyone who is or has been concerned about the influence of dark money in politics should pay attention. As the founding fathers warned, big moneyed interests have the power to radically undermine democracy. Already, a 2014 Princeton study has shown that America isn't even a democracy, but a plutocracy. Researchers found that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. In other words, public preference has zero effect on the legislative agenda. Wealthy elites move policy, not voters. Specifically, the Princeton researchers found that, quote, when a majority of citizens disagrees with economic elites and or with organized interests, they generally lose. Moreover, because of the strong status quo bias built into the U.S. political system, even when fairly large majorities of Americans favor policy change, they generally do not get it. They conclude, we believe that if policymaking is dominated by powerful business organizations and a small number of affluent Americans, then America's claims to being a democratic society are seriously threatened. With all the crowing Democrats are doing right now about the need to save our democracy, addressing the corrupting influence of money in politics is suspiciously absent from the agenda. It wasn't always that way, though. Back in 2008, both Barack Obama and John McCain distinguished themselves in their respective party primaries by advocating strongly for campaign finance reform. But while John McCain opted for public campaign financing, Barack Obama reneged. As a McCain spokeswoman put it at the time, the true test of a candidate for president is whether he will stand on principle and keep his word to the American people. Barack Obama has failed in that test today, and the reversal of his promise to participate in the public finance system undermines his call for a new type of politics. I gotta say, no lies detected. Campaign finance reform became an issue in the 2020 primary race, during which Bernie Sanders embarrassed the large Democratic primary field by out-fundraising the lot of them, despite being the only candidate not to take corporate billionaire donations. It became an issue again at the end of the primary season when Senator Elizabeth Warren abandoned her no corruption messaging and accepted $9 million from a super PAC just before Super Tuesday. That infusion allowed her to stay in the race despite losing the confidence of small dollar donors, winning 0 primaries and coming in 3rd in her home state of Massachusetts. She was later required to report the source of her multi-million-dollar gift, a single Californian billionaire. To many progressives, this $1 billion donation undemocratically undermined the last remaining shot at a progressive populist in the White House, damning Bernie's campaign and sparking a whole other media cycle about the insidious influence of big money super PACs. While campaign finance reform has largely faded to the background of public discourse in the COVID era, Biden did try to pass some campaign finance legislation at the start of his presidency in the form of H.R. 1. However, the legislation could not get the 60 votes necessary to pass the Senate. There was a 50-50 partisan split with no Republicans supporting the reforms. Now, H.R. 1 would require super PACs and dark money groups to disclose their donors publicly. Remember, this is one of the biggest problems with super PACs. They make it hard to trace influence and make influence peddling harder to call out. The other issue is that super PACs allow individuals to get around the donation maximums that are intended to keep a few rich elites from having an undue influence on our political sphere. Now, H.R. 1 didn't do much to solve that second problem, which is perhaps the most important one. And here's the issue. Neither Republicans nor Democrats have demonstrated a real interest in getting money out of politics. And it's easy to see why when you look back to the Obama example or the Warren example. Why turn off the spigot when billionaire elites are all too willing to bail you out? This should be a huge political issue with bipartisan support. And kudos again to John McCain for trying. But today, where are the Republicans in all of this? Why is so much energy directed at calling out various corporations for having quote unquote woke politics when the issue should be of corporate interest and influence, period, regardless of whether a given company cynically funds a Pride Day parade? After all, many of these so-called woke corporations have historically given to Democrats and Republicans in approximately equal measure. DeSantis targeted PayPal, for example, as woke, but the PayPal PAC spent considerably more in the 2018 midterms on Republicans than Democrats, and it spent slightly more on Republicans during the 2016 general election season. The pendulum swung only slightly in favor of Democrats in 2020. As with most issues in politics, it's more top-down than left-right. It's a big club, and no, you are not in it. So, with that background, let's get back to the breaking news, the largest political donation in American history. The donation went to a political group controlled by Leonard Leo, the architect of the conservative Supreme Court supermajority, in the effort to end abortion rights, an effort which may dam what had looked like a pretty unstoppable red wave in the fall. Even if you agree with the cultural agenda of the Supreme Court, consider this. Most of the cases heard by the court have nothing to do with the cultural issues that dominate headlines. Leonard Leo's multi-decade project isn't just about affirmative action or the right to choose. As big as those issues are, the billions of dollars being spent are targeted to do so much more. The goal is to enact a radical social and economic agenda that can never have been achieved legislatively or democratically, because it's an unpopular agenda that's antagonistic to the interests of poor, middle, and working class people. And it's one that's extremely profitable for the rich. Why else would a billionaire spend well over $1 billion and change on this interest? Rich people didn't get this rich by making bad investments. So let's talk about it. What is Mr. Seed investing in? Looking closely at the Supreme Court decisions decided by a 5-4 split offers a clue. You see, researchers looked at the Roberts Court cases and drilled down on the 78 cases in which all 5 votes came from the conservative majority. In other words, it looked at cases that came down to a strict ideological divide to see what the true ideological goals of the court were. And what did they find? The cases all fell into 4 categories. 1, controlling the political process to benefit conservative candidates and policies. Okay. 2, protecting corporations from liability and letting polluters pollute. 3, restricting civil rights and condoning discrimination. And 4, advancing a far-right social agenda. Now, I'm assuming we'll disagree ideologically about some of those categories, but let's focus on number 2, where our interests are aligned regardless of our substantive politics. These are what I would call David versus Goliath cases. These cases concern how corporations use the courts to escape legislative accountability, how corporations create special rules that only they can play by. We know that the government is corrupt, that the swamp needs to be drained. But part of the reason it's gotten so bad is that regulators have had their hands tied by legal decisions that limit liability for the corporations that poison our communities, kill us with addictive or defective medications, and defraud us with predatory schemes. But Roberts Court has found that unions can bargain away workers' rights to have age discrimination claims heard in court. It's held that consumers couldn't bring class action lawsuits against corporations for low-dollar, high-volume frauds. It's held that employers can use coercive contracts that force employees to waive their statutory labor rights. I mean, that's not a bad deal if you have a multi-billion-dollar company and employees who want to exploit. But it's not such a good outcome if you, like most people, are a worker. Look, one thing I appreciate about conservatives is their preference for having laws established via the democratic process. I have been guilty of putting my hopes in an activist court, in part because the legislative process has become so gunked up by bad faith actors who, as we discussed, have little incentive to actually act on the policies their constituents want. But if we are going to call out left judicial activism, it's important to also recognize the legislative fiat that dark money conservative elites have been executing through the Supreme Court for decades. And if we really care about democracy, if we really want the country to be run by people and not billionaires of any political stripe, we have to get serious about getting money out of politics. So yeah, I've been watching David Sirota at The Lever tweeting furiously about this and being very frustrated that people aren't really paying attention to this story. And I think it's difficult for folks to kind of put their heads around why it matters that one person would give a $1.6 billion donation. You know, what does this have to do with me? That seems like very abstract. And I think it's partly because we haven't been having a robust public conversation about money and politics and the negative influence of it for a really long time.
Look, I feel very, I guess, differently than you on this issue. I don't think money in politics is a good thing, obviously. I don't think there's much way to get money out of politics. The stakes of politics are so high. When the stakes of politics, when so much is on the line for powerful moneyed actors, when the government has vast sweeping power to allow you to develop this piece of land or to protect your intellectual property for this or to stop a competitor from coming into the country, when they can do so much, people are going to spend, moneyed interests are going to spend so much money to do it, and just having law, it sounds, well, we'll just have laws preventing that money being spent in that way. Then more insidery people, then they have secret meetings with the congressmen, they take them to steak dinners, they take them nice vacations. Capital can always find a way, I think, around these constraints, and actually you end up just punishing people who aren't very well connected, and the only way they know how to spend, they know how to have influence over the government process is to just spend money. So I'm kind of much more skeptical, I think, than you are, and maybe of David Sirota, that efforts to it's a noble goal. It's because this is not good. Moneyed, wealthy interest buying preferred policies from the government is absolutely bad. But it seems like the left is disproportionately focused on, well, let's tinker with the rules so that they can't spend those money, where I'm saying let's lower their incentive to do so by giving the government less power to reward them.
Well, I think, and it's not just the left, I think the hero of this radar is really John McCain. The argument he was making was not to tinker with the rules, but to limit how much spending happens during campaigns by making it purely publicly financed. So this is something that happens in other countries where we see much less lobbying, much less corporate interest. To the point made in the top of the show, Ron DeSantis arguing that part of why we don't have the ability to import drugs from cheaper countries is because of pharmaceutical lobbying. It's the largest lobbying group in the country. You know, it has these effects. So what John McCain is saying, and what other countries have done, is to say you can only campaign for a certain part of the year. There are time limits on the length of campaigning, which cuts into the cost a great deal. And that you can only spend the money that is publicly raised. And that limits the size and scope of these campaigns a great deal. And it becomes a conversation much more about the issues and whether people are able to communicate to the public via televised debates and campaigning around the country, versus whether or not they can simply blanket an area with advertisements that shut out any possibility of real discourse and debate.
It goes to a very different approach that you and I have, where you, like with the DeSantis example, you look at, well, what limits could we place on the pharmaceutical corporations' abilities to spend money to help elect congressmen who are going to support laws and support appointments to the FDA that will be favorable to them. And I say, instead of doing that, what if the FDA had no power to stop Canadian drug manufacturers from selling their drugs here? Like, I would change that. I would change on that because we have a greater ability, in theory at least, to have a different government or to have a government with policies that are more sane or less restrictive. Whereas the limits on spending money, and I'm sure you disagree with this, but at the Supreme Court level, very decisively, have sort of been decided that it's hard to. The Supreme Court has said. That it's speech, this kind of money, and
yes,
they're
and that is the point of the radar, that the Supreme Court got that way and made that decision expressly because people like this billionaire donor, the billionaire donor, bought judges to create the kinds of outcomes that undermine our democracy. So I think that really does prove my point. And regardless of what your politics are, if you want your elected government to be responsive to the people and to have a democracy and to have a real democratic process, these kinds of multi-billion-dollar donations from people like this who are literally writing the laws and structuring them in their own interest, not in the interest of the people, are a huge and ongoing problem.
I think you're going to have such a hard time devising a system where the billionaires, the heads of the pharmaceutical companies, those people don't always have better direct access to legislators and can't leverage them in some way to get the outcomes they want, even if they can't write checks to their campaign.
Well, every other advanced industrialized country in the world who does not have this level of problem with corporate lobbying and the openness with which we have corporate lobbying in the United States of America, those are examples that we can look to. It's hardly an impossible feat.
All right, well, we'll have more Rising right after this. Stay tuned.